Okay, so the doors are officially closing. So I guess that is our cue to get started. First of all, I want to welcome you all and thank you for coming to tonight's LUCA workshop. Really, this is what we see as an opportunity for education and kind of a little bit of a two-way conversation out in the concourse and with the optional listening session later. The focus of this informational session right now is about 20 minutes, and we'll try and be quick. Make sure that you hear from us what we learned through our community survey process, as well as through the information and feedback we've been getting from the community for quite some time on the topic of homeless shelters, and specifically how the city could regulate homeless shelters in order to ensure that the use can be sited in Bellevue and sited and operated successfully. So with that, just a little bit of orientation about why we are here and what the Land Use Code Amendment objective is, and that again is looking at the city's vision. So the City Council sets policy for us, and they do that in a number of different ways here, directing where they believe our priorities are and what we are trying to accomplish. And one of the priorities they established back in 2014 was to find a permanent location for an East Side men's shelter. Homelessness is not a new issue. It's not an issue that's unique to Bellevue. It's a regional issue, and we have been approaching services and sheltering for homeless as an East Side in partnership with many other jurisdictions. And the council, in recognition of that, focused in 2014 on this particular priority. In addition, the council sets a number of other policy framework for us and for the work that we do through the comprehensive plan. And again, there's a lot there about being a compassionate community, about being a community of very livable neighborhoods, of being a community where everyone is welcome and where people feel and are safe in their community. And much of what we do is balancing all of those policies, and in particular with respect to this Land Use Code Amendment, balancing those policies around how do we successfully site a homeless shelter. And again, we appreciate all of your involvement in that process. It is really through hearing from the community that we help to gauge whether how we are striking that balance and whether it's meeting the community expectations. So thank you for your time. Just a very brief context setting in terms of where we are. So right now, as I said, we are here with this information and education workshop. We're going to do 2 more this week. It is very similar to what you're seeing tonight. So if you have come tonight, you do not need to come to the other 2 that are both taking place on Thursday, one at Crossroads Community Center and one in South Bellevue. But of course, if you know folks who couldn't be here tonight and were interested, please help them understand that there are more opportunities coming up on Thursday to hear very much of this same information. There'll be a little bit shorter, a little bit less of the bells and whistles that you're getting here tonight. We also will post this informational session online for folks to watch in the future. With that, I want to turn over to Nancy Lacombe, who is an assistant director in the city manager's office, to describe a very high level of detail the information we learned from our community survey.
Thank you, Kate. Good evening. So like Kate said, I'm going to sort of run through relatively quickly through the survey data that we ran. As you saw on the slide right before this, it ran for about 2 weeks. Of course, you know, Murphy's Law says that when the day we put the survey out, there was a glitch in the Survey Monkey and there was some problems, but there was only one the first day it went out, and everything else after that was doing relatively well. But as you can see from this slide, we had almost 1,900 responses to our survey. And you can see that there's an 85% response rate or completion rate. What that means is that some people came into the survey and they didn't finish it and they came out of it. And that could have been staff going in to check it to make sure it was okay, somebody coming and going, whoa, that's not the survey I want to do. So that's really what that number lets us know. And on average, it took people about 10 minutes to complete the survey. All of this information is uploaded on our website now, including the raw data, which is in an Excel spreadsheet. So if you want to take a look at this information, it's uploaded onto our website, and you can take a look at it in much more detail. So this slide here shows that from the different neighborhoods that we got responses from. As you can see, there was about 14-15% that came from the Lake Hills and the Eastgate area, and the remaining neighborhoods were about 5 to 6%. There's also about maybe a little bit over 5% that came from folks that were not Bellevue residents, and that could be from folks that are service providers that were answering the survey as well. one of the next questions were the additional demographics. We wanted to find out how many people were client, owner, operators, and also if they were a Bellevue business owner. So from here you see we had about 3% that were client or operators or a provider, and we had about 13% that were Bellevue business owners that answered the survey. When we asked about the elements that we thought that the neighbors or the community thought we should include into to define a permanent shelter, as you can see across the board, there was quite a few different areas that are relatively similar, but the top 3 are listed in there, which was, see if I can see it up there, access to food. The second one was access to case management, and then the third one was access to showers and laundry. And then the next question was whether or not what things the shelter should be located adjacent to or near. The number one was to, I can't read on the little screen, social services. Number 2 was to transit services. And number 3 was to health services, which you can see there's also from this graphic here, there was quite a few that were right below that was employment services and workforce training, as well as public facilities. So they're relative, I'm going to say relatively even, but pretty close. What it should not be located near from here is number 1 was for primary schools, number 2 was from preschools and daycares, and then number 3 was from single-family neighborhoods. The next question we asked was related to what should be in the submittal requirements, and this slide here shows that about 26% felt that the a good neighbor plan should be included, as well as a code of conduct. So the way I looked at this slide was, or this data was that 50% of the folks were interested in what goes on in and around the facility itself, and the remaining 50%, such as the screening, the site layout, and exterior drawings, were some things that happen on the what is it physically, what are the physical characteristics of the shelter. And then in the good neighbor and stakeholder input, we asked folks what should be included in those. And as you can see from here was what should be included in the stakeholder meetings, or the stakeholder group that would provide input into the land use code amendment, or to the shelter, not a land use code amendment, into the shelter, the actual should a shelter be sited in a location. The residential neighborhoods should be included, public safety should be included in those stakeholder groups, as well as subject matter experts. We also had an open comment on that particular question about if there was any other groups that that should be included but weren't, and students and schools came up pretty high on that list as well. Healthcare providers, council members, transit customers, you see those are also items that were folks that people would like to see included in those stakeholder meetings. On question number 10, we did ask about any additional comments that we weren't included in some of the other topics, or you wanted to provide additional input there wasn't space to add it, so we had one open-ended question in here, or one large open-ended question in here. And we sort of separated into common themes about what all the information that we got. So common definitions for key terms was a point that people wanted us to be able to take a look at. Also, council exploring different policy direction, such as maybe not having a shelter, or putting a shelter someplace, or not, I guess not having a shelter, having a different type of shelter. Input onto the location of the shelter and proximity of other uses. They also wanted to have an input on the shelter operations, and then safety concerns, as well as input to future public engagement processes, and input on the code requirements and the application requirements. This one we sort of asked because we wanted to find out when we put information out to the community, how is it being received, or where are people picking up their information about the city? And the number one location was from Nextdoor. The second was from the email alerts that the city hands out. And then the third one was from other prints, such as the Bellevue Reporter. With that, I'm going to turn it over back to Kate again.
So reflected here is really where we are at in the process now. So as I mentioned before, the community and the council have been engaged for some time on talking about homelessness and talking about the city's response to homelessness. We have talked about that in the past as sort of a three-pronged approach. So there is the services. How do we help people avoid being homeless? How do we help people who are in homelessness get out of homelessness? The council has adopted the county-wide approach of homelessness should be rare, brief, and one time. What another leg of that stool is facilities. What facilities do we have? And obviously we're here tonight talking about how does the city regulate a facility of a homeless shelter. And the third prong of the city's approach has been looking at enforcement tools. So again, that balance of being compassionate, ensuring that we have facilities and services that can help folks, but making sure we are also maintaining community expectations around quality of life and a number of those other policies. We have been hearing from the community for about 18 months on these topics, and our goal with the survey was really to reflect back to the community many of the themes that we had heard, whether it's in the context of a specific shelter or in the context of enforcement or any of those other contexts, that we could learn from that information and help reflect that back in the work that we are now doing about regulations for siting of a homeless shelter. So we wanted people to understand what we had already heard, what we've already learned, how that's informing what's going into the land use code amendment, so that you know then how to engage going forward. So where are we starting at now, and how do you engage the council going forward? So that's really where we are. We're getting into that phase of working with the council and the community on the specific land use code regulations, and to describe more about what you can expect to see in regulations and what the process and schedule with the council will be like. I'd like to introduce Carol Helland. She is our Code and Policy Director.
Thank you, Kate, and good evening, everybody. It's actually a delight to see you all here because it means you're all taking time out of your busy schedules to help inform our process and make it better. So I really appreciate the commitment that you're making and the investment you're making in making our code the best it can be. As Kate noted, the workshop kind of marks this formal bridge between the policy development framework that we've been in and the discussion we've been having about should we have a shelter, what kind of shelter, where should a shelter be, to the brass tacks of writing code that will effectively regulate what a shelter looks like should someone propose one in the city of Bellevue. So we've received the council direction. Kate mentioned that. We've been asked to bring forward code amendment language for the council to consider. They adopt any code that we would draft for their consideration. And then we've also collected a lot of information. The information we've been collecting over the course of the last couple of years, as Kate described. And then now as we move forward to this code drafting process and phase, we're culling that information as the framework for how we move forward and the things that are important to Bellevue residents so that we ensure that the code amendment is aligned with people's vision for Bellevue. For those of you who aren't familiar with the permitting in the city, which I like permitting. I'm kind of a permitting wonk. I'm kind of a code wonk too. And I know that can be complex. So I was trying to think of an analogy that might help people kind of understand more about what the land use code is and what an amendment process is. So I thought it might be helpful for people to think of the land use code kind of as a cookbook. So when people come in, they say, I want to build an office building. And I need to understand what's the recipe for building an office building. And we show them the parts of the land use code that apply. And then they essentially put the office building proposal together. And our staff as regulators then review that proposal against the code to determine whether it meets the expectations of our community. So if we think about it in that framework, what we've been doing kind of over the last couple of years is what are the important ingredients for a shelter to be successful in this city? You know, we've heard that good neighbor agreements are something that we need. We've heard that codes of conduct are important to people. We've heard that there are, in reviewing other shelters elsewhere, there are best practices about separating elevators in a shelter from an elevator in supportive housing that maybe occupy the same building. So we'll be taking all of that information and drafting a code that reflects the feedback that we've heard and the research we've done. And the hope is actually to carry on the analogy to kind of a cookbook, then just about anyone who comes into the city who is a developer of a shelter proposal could look at our code, understand what the community values, and design a shelter that would be aligned with those values. So I just wanted to reiterate some of the information that we've received to date and what we've looked at. All of this is available on the website. So if you go to our Hot Topics button on our website and then look at homelessness, you will find a library of information that's been created over the last few years. But so far, our review to date has included a lot of information from community groups. We've heard from residents all over the city. We've also heard from some very organized residents, such as the Eastgate Community Association. And then we reviewed our city due diligence report, and we did a bunch of best practice research, like I indicated previously. So we've toured shelters, we've visited some of them, and also talked to operators about how what the recipe for success is, effectively. We also did our survey, and the results of the survey Nancy shared. And then we're presenting this land use code amendment and a framework that's going with it, which you can actually get some information on your one-page handouts outside about kind of thinking, what is the recipe that Bellevue needs to have a successful shelter code? And then we're going to listen to your feedback and again, start thinking about what we need to do to include information in the code, and we'll then engage the city council. The initial land use code framework, there are not words on a piece of paper yet that anybody's ready to review, but this slide essentially shows the best practice for writing a code amendment. And we do have a board out front that looks something like this that you can look at that talks about the topics that need to be in a land use code amendment. So first of all, we need to have a purpose that it tells us why is the land use code section important? What are we trying to accomplish? Because it gives us a goal. Then we talk about its applicability. What kinds of uses do we apply this code to? For instance, an example might be this code is intended to talk about permanent overnight shelters, maybe some other functions. It probably is not going to be intended to talk about emergency shelters, which are regulated under a separate section of the code. So that's what applicability talks about. And definitions are important, and we want to hear information about what you think would be helpful to have as defined terms, because we want to make sure we administer the code consistently, so having the same understanding of common terms is a good idea, and that also reduces confusion and misunderstandings. We also have to decide what the permit process is going to be. There's been several different approaches discussed. Right now, the interim official control actually describes a conditional use permit process. There's also been some discussion of a development agreement. So we'll be sorting that out and making a proposal to the city council for the best process to move forward with shelter development review. And then we talk about the wheres and the hows. And that's the kind of the brass tacks of how does this shelter, how does any shelter that's proposed in the city really is really complementary and compatible with the surrounding uses. So that talks about kind of use requirements. Like we talked about before, you would have a requirement for a code of conduct for the operations that happen inside the shelter, or a good neighbor plan that talks about how does the shelter relate to the uses around it. The development standards are pretty straightforward. Those are things like we have height limits, we have setbacks, we have landscaping plans. So that will probably just be provisions from the code that talk about development generally for whatever district that the use is ultimately located in. So for instance, downtown has development regulations that are different than Wilburton or Bell Red. So those underlying development standards with respect to height, setback, bulk, scale would likely apply to this use. And then design guidelines tell us a little bit more about what's the more granular design issues that we need to address. So are there things that make this use even more compatible and the design a real asset to the community? So with respect to next steps, the council code review will be initiated actually following this workshop and the wrap up of the listening sessions, and we'll be developing a draft code for council consideration that will be released later in April. We have a couple of meetings planned during study sessions in May, and the hope is that we get to a public hearing in the June timeframe and a July adoption for this code amendment. I think that council has challenged us to move forward with a code amendment before the summer break to try and complete our work before the community oftentimes goes on vacation. So we are going to be trying our best to do that. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Kate for wrapping up.
All right, thanks very much. So we're trying to keep this to 20 minutes because there's an opportunity for you to learn a lot more about each of the things we talked about tonight. Out in the concourse, we have a lot of city staff here to answer your questions. There's opportunities, again, for you to ask questions in more depth and provide more feedback. So I want to invite you back out to the concourse to do that. I do also want to flag that there is an opportunity, an optional opportunity, starting at 6:45 in the conference room next door to participate in a listening session. We have created some tabletop conversation starters to talk about what have you learned through this process. What else should we be considering as we think about striking that balance and ensuring that this kind of use can be successful in the city of Bellevue. That is just optional. So if you don't have the time to stay all the way until 8 o'clock, certainly go out to the concourse and get your questions answered and let us know if there's anything else you need. We will be doing another one of these informational sessions, I think starting at about 6:25. So if you see the doors closing again, you're not missing anything. It's the same thing that you've just seen. And so with that, again, thank you very much for being here, and thanks to all the staff and council that are here tonight to hear what you have to say. Thank you.